In the chaotic aftermath of the Second World War, as the guns fell silent and Europe lay in ruins, an often overlooked human story unfolded inside the barbed wire fences of Allied-run prisoner camps, one that revealed the deep scars of war and the fragile humanity that somehow survived it. Among the millions of German prisoners captured by the victorious Allies were not only soldiers and officers, but also a surprising number of women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, and civilians swept up in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Many of these women had served in the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, or as Red Cross workers. When they were rounded up in 1945, their world, once ruled by ideology, discipline, and the illusion of victory, suddenly shattered into fear and uncertainty. Their captivity began not with comfort, but with terror. Inside these makeshift camps, often converted military depots, abandoned airfields, or fenced-off farmlands, rumors spread like wildfire, tales of vengeful guards, of revenge for atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, and of what might await Hitler's women, now that Germany had lost. So when the guards approached their barracks, heavy boots echoing against the muddy ground, the women often screamed, not out of guilt or defiance, but from the raw fear of the unknown. Every knock on the wooden doors carried the weight of vengeance, the memory of war crimes, and the haunting possibility that they might now pay for the sins of their nation. For many of these women, the psychological strain of captivity was compounded by the sudden collapse of everything they had believed in. Just months before, propaganda had filled their ears with visions of German superiority, of a Reich that would last 1,000 years. Now, they were prisoners in their own homeland, watched by men they had been taught to see as enemies, or even monsters. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, lice, disease, and cold became daily companions. Some were mothers separated from children, others young secretaries who had never even seen the front lines but were caught in the sweeping tide of Allied retribution. In the British and American zones, conditions varied. Some camps provided basic medical aid and rations, while others were barely organized, overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners. Yet even in the best circumstances, the emotional toll was crushing. German women, many of them raised in a culture of obedience and fear, were now confronted with humiliation, uncertainty, and the terrifying power dynamic of captivity. Inside the camp, silence often dominated the early days. Women whispered among themselves in their bunks, clutching whatever remnants of personal belongings they had managed to keep, a photograph, a rosary, or a scrap of cloth from a lost uniform. The sound of approaching boots or the clang of the metal gate could freeze the entire barracks into stillness. Some cried quietly in the dark, unable to reconcile the brutal collapse of the world they once knew. To them, every Allied soldier was a symbol of destruction, a living reminder of the bombings that had leveled their cities, the loved ones buried in the rubble, and the shame of defeat. Many guards, too, were wary. They had seen the horrors of concentration camps, the skeletal remains of Holocaust victims, the piles of bodies left behind by the regime these women had served. Trust, in those early days, was impossible. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, a strange transformation began to take place, one not of politics or ideology, but of humanity. When guards knocked on the barrack doors, the women's screams were reflexive, born from terror and confusion. But when the same guards returned, sometimes carrying food, medical supplies, or small gestures of kindness, the screams began to fade. What came instead was something unexpected: tears. The guards who had once seemed like avengers became, in the eyes of many women, the first flicker of compassion they had seen in months. And when the guards, many of them young men barely older than the prisoners themselves, offered something as simple as a piece of chocolate, it shattered the emotional walls that fear had built. The chocolate wasn't just a treat, it was a symbol that they were still human, still seen, still worth something more than the hatred of war. In that moment, amidst the wreckage of Europe, a small but profound connection was made, not between enemies, but between people who had both survived the unthinkable. Seasons, life inside the Allied-run camps for German women began to settle into a grim routine that blurred the lines between punishment, survival, and a quiet search for dignity. Every sunrise brought with it the same dull rhythm, the sound of boots on gravel, the rattling of tin cups against wire fences, the cold morning roll call where names were recited like confessions. Yet beneath that surface of military order, there lived a deeper, more complex emotional landscape. For many of the women, the camp was not merely a place of confinement but a mirror reflecting everything they had lost: family, homeland, innocence, and, most painfully, the moral clarity of right and wrong. In a world where they had been indoctrinated to believe in victory and racial superiority, they now found themselves powerless before the very people they had been told to despise. It was an inversion so total that even those who had never believed in Nazi ideology felt crushed beneath its ruin. The war had ended, but the emotional battle for understanding, forgiveness, and self-worth had just begun. The British and American camps, though far less brutal than those in Soviet-controlled zones, still carried their share of hardship. The infrastructure was overwhelmed, and resources scarce. Many of the guards were soldiers fresh from the front, men who had seen Dachau, Buchenwald, or Bergen-Belsen with their own eyes, and whose compassion was tempered by the memories of what German hands had done. They did their duty, but a distance remained, a moral and emotional gulf between captor and captive. For the women, every act of kindness came as both a blessing and a torment, because it reminded them that their captors were capable of mercy while their own side had not been. The first moments of fear began to erode not through lectures or punishments, but through the mundane realities of daily life, sharing rations, tending to the sick, and occasionally hearing a guard's laughter echo faintly across the camp. One of the most striking aspects of these camps was the emotional duality that defined them. In the early days, the women wept not only out of fear of what the Allies might do, but also out of grief for the Germany that no longer existed. The once proud Reich was now rubble and ash. The propaganda that had glorified them as the backbone of the fatherland now seemed like a grotesque joke. In their quiet moments, many of them began to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had lived within a lie, whether by belief or by silence. The guards' presence forced them to see the war from the other side, and for some, this realization was more painful than captivity itself. They began to ask themselves silent, unspoken questions: how had they come to this? Had they truly been victims, or had they been part of the machine that brought Europe to ruin? These reflections often broke them in ways that hunger and cold never could. The human connection that began to form between captors and captives was not immediate, nor was it without conflict. There were moments of mistrust, misunderstandings born from language barriers, and outbursts from guards still carrying the emotional weight of friends lost in the war. Yet, small gestures began to pierce the divide. A British guard might look away when a woman pocketed an extra slice of bread. An American soldier might quietly hand over a cigarette or a blanket. And sometimes, on rare and unforgettable occasions, someone would share a piece of chocolate, a ration so precious that its sweetness carried a weight far greater than its taste. To the women, these gestures did not erase their fear or hunger, but they introduced something new: the realization that the world beyond the wire might not be entirely cruel. For many, this realization came as an emotional shock. They had been told that the Allies were barbarians, that capture meant humiliation or worse. So when the guards treated them with unexpected civility, it dismantled the last walls of Nazi propaganda that had shaped their worldview. Some cried openly when given chocolate, not because of the sweetness, but because of the unbearable contrast between what they had been told to expect and the reality of human decency. It was as if the smallest act of kindness revealed the entire fraud of the ideology they had once lived under. The tears that followed were not merely of gratitude, they were of shame, relief, and mourning for all that had been lost in the madness of belief. Life in those camps slowly transformed into a kind of fragile coexistence. The women began to organize themselves, maintaining some form of discipline and cleanliness, often encouraged by the guards who preferred order over chaos. Some of them taught others to sew or read, others helped with nursing duties, treating both fellow prisoners and occasionally even Allied personnel. In those shared spaces, medical tents, kitchens, makeshift chapels, the first hints of reconciliation began to bloom. Guards who had initially viewed their charges with suspicion began to see them as individuals rather than faceless symbols of the enemy. They learned their names, their stories, the families they had lost, the cities they once called home. And in return, the women began to see the guards not as conquerors, but as men, young, tired, burdened by their own memories of war. The symbolism of chocolate became one of the quiet legends whispered among prisoners. To those who received it, it became more than a taste of the outside world, it was proof that even in defeat, humanity survived. Women would break small pieces to share with others, saving crumbs as if they were sacred. Some wrote about it later in diaries that were smuggled out or preserved long after their release. In those writings, the moment of receiving chocolate is often described as a turning point, the instant when the walls of fear finally cracked and something almost like hope entered the camp. The guards, too, often remembered these exchanges years later, describing them as moments when the uniform, the barbed wire, and the memory of war all seemed to dissolve, leaving only the shared exhaustion of people who had seen too much. But even as these small bridges were built, the emotional wounds of the war ran deep. Not all guards were kind, and not all women were innocent. Some had been fervent supporters of the Nazi cause, others had participated in its machinery of cruelty. Within the camps, divisions often arose between those who sought repentance and those who clung to denial. There were whispers, accusations, and confessions. Some women admitted to roles in concentration camps or propaganda offices, while others had simply been nurses or clerks caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Allies faced a moral challenge: how to administer justice without descending into vengeance. For many guards, this meant walking a delicate line between duty and empathy, treating prisoners firmly but fairly, while never forgetting what had been discovered in places like Auschwitz. Yet time has a way of softening even the hardest hearts. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the women began to rebuild fragments of normalcy. They sang quietly in the evenings, wrote letters when permitted, and dreamed of returning home, even though home was now a wasteland divided by occupation zones. Many of the younger women found themselves talking to the guards more openly, asking about their families, about America or Britain, about what life might be like after release. Some guards responded with kindness, others with distance, but the conversations themselves were proof that the war's hatred was slowly giving way to something else. Humanity, long buried under propaganda and pain, was beginning to re-emerge. When the first groups of women were finally released, they carried with them not just the scars of imprisonment but also the strange memory of kindness from their captors. Many returned to find their towns destroyed, their families missing, and their homeland carved into two opposing worlds, East and West. Yet in their memories of captivity, they often recalled not the fear of the first knocks on the door, but the tears that followed when the guards brought chocolate. It was a small story in the vast tragedy of war, but it captured something eternal, the fragile thread of compassion that can survive even in the ruins of hatred. The story of these German women POWs is not one of absolution, but of recognition, that even in the darkest aftermath of human conflict, mercy can exist where it is least expected. The chocolate, the simple knock, the shared glance across a fence, all became symbols of a deeper truth, that no ideology, no war, no victory or defeat can erase the human capacity for kindness. It is this truth that allowed some of the women to live on without bitterness, to rebuild their lives, and, in some cases, to even tell their children that not all enemies were cruel. The guards, too, carried those memories, long after they had returned home, as proof that amidst the moral wreckage of the 20th century, small acts of decency had kept the world from losing its soul entirely. As 1946 unfolded, the post-war camps housing German women prisoners became a strange kind of purgatory, neither war nor peace, neither punishment nor redemption. The guns had long fallen silent, but inside the fences, the echoes of conflict still lived on in the hearts and minds of both captives and guards. The women had grown accustomed to the rhythms of captivity, the roll calls at dawn, the ration queues, the endless counting of days that stretched like an eternity. Yet even as they adapted to this limbo, their thoughts wandered beyond the wire, to the world that had changed forever. Germany was now a nation divided, its cities reduced to rubble, its name synonymous with ruin and guilt. For the women in the camps, this realization was a slow and painful awakening. In their isolation, they began to confront not only their country's defeat but also their personal complicity in a system that had brought untold suffering. Whether they had served in uniform or simply lived under Nazi rule, the moral reckoning could not be escaped. Each passing day felt like a test, not of endurance, but of conscience. Life inside the camps took on a rhythm of contrasts. There was harshness, yes, hunger, cold, and the occasional cruelty of guards whose patience had worn thin. But there was also an undeniable undercurrent of humanity struggling to rise from the ashes. Many of the guards, especially the younger American and British soldiers, found themselves torn between duty and empathy. They had been raised to see the Germans as the architects of the world's suffering, yet the women before them did not look like monsters. They were thin, frightened, and often no older than their own sisters. Their eyes told stories of loss, not only of loved ones, but of beliefs, of certainty, of identity. Slowly, the guards began to see them not as Nazis, but as human beings who had also paid a terrible price for the war. This gradual change of perception didn't erase the past, but it softened the edges of hatred that had defined the early months of captivity. By now, camp life was organized with precision. Work details were assigned, some women cleaned, others cooked or assisted in makeshift infirmaries. Education classes began to appear in some camps, where Allied officers encouraged prisoners to read newspapers, learn about democracy, and understand the crimes of the Nazi regime. It was part of what the Allies called re-education, though to many women it felt more like humiliation at first. They resisted, unwilling to accept that everything they had been taught was false. But slowly, as newspapers brought news of the Nuremberg trials, of concentration camp revelations, of testimony from victims and perpetrators alike, the walls of denial began to crumble. The women could no longer hide behind ignorance. They began to understand that their fear of Allied guards, the screaming, the trembling at every knock on the door, had been born from the same propaganda that had blinded them during the war. And with that realization came guilt, deep and heavy, unlike anything they had ever felt. For some, the emotional breakdown was too much to bear. There were instances of suicide, of women unable to reconcile their sense of self with the enormity of what their country had done. Others found solace in faith, gathering secretly to pray in the barracks. The sound of quiet hymns would sometimes drift through the night, haunting, fragile, almost defiant in its beauty. Guards who heard these songs often paused, listening from outside the wire, realizing that both sides were haunted by ghosts they could not name. In those moments, the war's victors and the defeated seemed equally burdened by memory. Compassion began to bloom not from pity, but from shared exhaustion. Both had seen too much death, too much destruction. Both longed for something pure, even if it was as fleeting as a melody in the dark. The transformation of the camps was not only emotional but also symbolic. The fear that once defined every interaction slowly gave way to fragile trust. When guards approached now, the women no longer screamed. The knocks on the doors no longer meant punishment or humiliation, they often meant news, work assignments, or the distribution of small comforts like soap, cigarettes, or that now legendary chocolate. Each piece handed out carried a story, a connection that crossed the boundaries of language and allegiance. The act of sharing became an unspoken ritual of reconciliation. A guard might slip a bar through the wire, saying nothing, while the woman on the other side would take it with trembling hands and tears in her eyes. No words were needed. In a world that had been consumed by hatred, this small act carried the weight of redemption. Among the guards, stories of these encounters spread quietly. Some found themselves deeply moved, even disturbed, by the emotions they stirred. They had expected to hate the Germans forever, to see them as faceless enemies deserving only scorn. But these women, stripped of everything, showed a vulnerability that defied hatred. In their faces, the guards saw reflections of their own humanity, their own losses. One British soldier later wrote in a letter home that handing chocolate to a German prisoner made him feel more human than all the medals and victories in the world. Another American, stationed near Stuttgart, confessed that he could never forget the moment when a group of captured German nurses began to cry as he passed out small sweets from his ration. They wept, he wrote, as if that taste of chocolate reminded them that the war was truly over. Meanwhile, outside the camps, Germany's landscape mirrored the emotional ruin within the fences. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were little more than charred skeletons of stone. Families were displaced, millions homeless, hunger rampant. The women prisoners knew that even if they were freed, they would return to nothing. Some secretly longed to remain in the camps, not because of comfort, but because at least there was order, food, and a strange kind of safety. The outside world was chaos, inside the camp, time stood still. The guards, too, sensed this unease. They saw in the women's eyes not just gratitude for kindness, but fear of the future. Where would they go? What kind of Germany would they return to? No one had the answers. In time, the relationships between guards and prisoners grew more layered. There were occasional romances, forbidden, fleeting, and often tragic. A few women fell in love with their captors, drawn not by infatuation but by the desperate need for connection in a world that had forgotten tenderness. Some guards felt the same pull, torn between regulation and emotion. Letters were hidden, glances exchanged, promises whispered through fences. When discovered, such liaisons were punished harshly, but the very fact that they happened revealed something profound: the human spirit's refusal to be defined solely by war. These were not tales of scandal but of healing, broken souls reaching for warmth in the ruins of ideology. By the late 1940s, the process of release began. Many of the women were sent home in groups, carrying little more than a blanket, a pair of shoes, and the distant hope of starting again. As they left the camps, some wept openly, not only from joy but from the strange attachment they felt to the place where fear had first consumed them, and where kindness had quietly saved them. The guards watched them go, offering final farewells, sometimes with one last bar of chocolate pressed into their hands. It was a gesture that needed no explanation. It symbolized an ending, of captivity, of hatred, of a chapter in history written in both cruelty and compassion. The legacy of those encounters would live on long after the camps closed. Many of the women carried the memory of that bittersweet kindness for the rest of their lives. Some wrote memoirs, others spoke in interviews decades later, always recalling the same detail: the chocolate, the knock on the door, the tears that followed. For the guards, those moments became part of their own reckoning, proof that mercy could exist even in the ruins of war. Historians often overlook these small, human episodes amid the vast chronicles of battles and treaties, but it is precisely in these quiet exchanges that the true story of post-war Europe can be found. Because the war was not only fought with guns and bombs, it was fought in the hearts of men and women who had to unlearn hate. The German women who once screamed at the sound of a guard's knock had learned, by the end of their captivity, that compassion could come from the unlikeliest of hands. And the guards who once saw only enemies behind the wire discovered that victory without empathy is hollow. In the ruins of a broken continent, they taught each other something that no army, no government, and no ideology could ever impose: that even after unimaginable darkness, the smallest act of humanity can light the way forward.